I made a Souls-like game in a month. Well, just the combat part. It all started with a game jam. More specifically, the Boss Rush Game Jam 2024. It's a month-long jam and I joined it 3 days late. The theme of the jam is exchange. So, like a rational person, I decided to make a Souls-like. Well, not that kind of Souls-like, just the boss fights. I started the project like all projects do, with a bean. Well, no, I used a stretched cube. I had enough of beans for now. Anyway, I quickly got the cube moving. Well, the cube got moving eventually. Now, just need to make the camera follow the cube and give it some collisions so nothing would block the view. Then I made sure movement on uneven ground worked. And I made the cube rotate in its movement direction. And lastly, for the basic stuff, I made a camera lock-on like you see in Souls games. Now I started making the main character. I gathered a bunch of references and started blocking out the proportions. I decided to go for a claymation style for the character. I wasn't yet sure on this style, but I decided to at least give it a try. So I went on sculpting the character. This whole process was quite weird for me and took longer than it probably should have. But in the end, I made this little guy, the Clay Knight. With the model complete, I began animating, starting with movement animations. Since the character is supposed to always be looking at his lockdown target, I had to make multiple movement animations, one for each direction. So we got the forward, backward, right side and left side movement animations. Then I put the character in the game and got him running. Now I wanted to add a dodge roll, so I started animating it with some Dark Souls reference on the side. For the roll movement, I wanted to use root motion. You might be wondering, what is root motion? Well, it's basically motion that moves the character directly in the animation. So, instead of having game code tell the character how to move, the animation does it instead. This can, however, lead to some very unintended behavior, like the character completely ignoring collisions and just going through walls, ignoring slopes and whatnot. So, I had to read the root motion data and transfer the movement to use physics. All of this was easier said than done. This whole root motion to physics thing really tried its best not to work. Rolling on slopes was causing super sliding, so I fixed that. Rolling at low FPS is just flat out not working correctly. So I tried fixing it, spent an entire day on it, and the solution? Don't play below 30 FPS. I couldn't even get a consistent solution. Then we got roll teleporting, but only when starting the roll mid-air. And then that. Slopes are still slippery. Eventually, I sort out most of those things and add sprinting. Then I make some UI for health and stamina, so I could work on implementing those features. So things like rolling and sprinting would consume stamina. Now I started animating some basic attacks to add damage functionality. These animations would also use root motion. And of course, they didn't work correctly. The roll was still working, but the attacks were going nuts. After a bit, I thought I had it fixed. But then I found another bug. The first attack would work perfectly, but if you timed the second attack just right, you start sliding. This was an issue with disabling and enabling root motion. Then I also noticed a bug with rolling. If you spam it, you can move around whilst in a roll animation. I also found a weird interaction when you immediately roll after attacking. You just kind of faceplant. After a while, I got everything to mostly work, so I made a roll sound. At this time, I still wasn't completely sure on the art style, so I made it sound metallic, which I later changed. Back to present, I'm making more animations, like falling down. You can do a get up roll to stand up faster. With damage working, it was finally time to add healing. So I drew some potion sprites in 4 different states: full, half, 1 sip away from empty, and of course empty. Then I made yet another animation for drinking, set everything up, and healing was working just fine. Now I wanted to make taking damage to be more responsive, so I added procedural damage flinch. It's especially apparent on attacks that don't stagger. After that, I animated some heavy attacks. You can, of course, charge them for extra damage. Now that the core features of the game were done, I made a main menu. I decided to do this now since making it at the end of the jam could pose unexpected issues. And I made it fully controller compatible. I probably didn't have to do this, but I did. Anyway, it's already been 10 days and I still don't have a boss or even a level. So I start working on a level first. I get some basic shapes in for the arena's proportions and then add a skybox to set the mood of the level. I use the skybox shader from my previous project. It allows me to tweak pretty much everything. I end up with this green spooky look. Then I add some boxes to represent buildings, make some hills, and then realize my idea for the level is overscoped. So I start from scratch in Blender, this time making a much more closed space, but still keeping it outdoors. I make a bunch of different models and put them in the game to check how they fit. And now it was all coming together. I did this a few more times and then changed the skybox color to a blue one, since I'm no longer following my initial idea. It's 15 days till the end of the jam and I still have no boss, so it's time to make one. I want to make a giant skeleton as the first boss, and the first attempt is not looking too good. I try again and look at the difference. What was I thinking with this one? I rig the new boss and make a sword for him and the player, and all that's left is animating this undead knight. At first, I wanted the skeleton to permanently be dragging the sword behind him, but I had issues thinking of how I would animate him walking backwards or sideways. So I ended up making him hold the sword on his shoulder, but he still has an attack where he drags the sword. Then I just make a few more combo attacks and put the boss in the game. Firstly, I just get him to walk around. The skeleton's movement is a bit jittery, so I finally add some smoothing between the movement animations. And finally, I make the boss attack you. Everything surprisingly works pretty well, but it's still missing a lot of things. So I made a list of stuff I need to add, starting with sounds. I start with weapon swooshes. Then I make a few hit sounds. The way I make them is using a bunch of samples. Also, I get some environment impact sounds. I then add some extra sounds for the skeleton's sword drag. At this point, I've been playtesting the boss a lot and noticed that the player's dodge is really slow. So I went back to Blender and increased its speed by a decent amount. With the new dodging, the boss fight is feeling great. Lastly, for sounds, I make some new footsteps, both for the player and the boss. For the time being, that's all the sounds I make. And now it's finally time to make a boss bar, and I do just that. The overall UI of the game is not great, pretty much just flat colors. None of my games have particularly good looking UI, so this time I wanted to try and make an actually good looking user interface. So I do a bunch of drawing and layering, and in the end I get a pretty good looking result. Overall, I'm really happy with how the UI turned out. So far, the boss fight is feeling pretty good, but the player is still lacking light attack animations. So I remake the 2 existing ones and add 3 more. Well, technically 2. The last one is just a transition point between the 4th attack and the first one. And now the player has a pretty decent combo. You can loop the combo if you have enough stamina. Finally, it's time to finish the environment. So I start breaking apart the level to make proper ruins. Then I fix the topology of the broken parts, which took a very boring amount of time. And now I get to do some fun stuff. Physics simulation. After doing a bunch of simulations and a bunch of tweaks, I end up with a fairly decent result. Then I put it all in the game, made some tweaks and slapped on some textures. At first I added some detailed textures. Then I tried more subtle ones, which I decided to keep. I tweaked them a bit more and then started working on the ground. I used 2 ground textures, some dirt and some stone looking one. Then I blended them with the height map of paint, which made it look much better than regular blending. For smaller details I made gravestones and candles. With these props I decorated the map, and with that the level was complete. The game is still missing visual effects, so it's about time to add them. Firstly, I made a simple hit effect. When you hit a boss or when you get hit, a bunch of clay chunks go flying. Secondly, I made some simple healing particles. Third, I tried making some ground impacts when the boss slams his sword. I got the effect done, but it spawns in a completely wrong place. So I investigate what's going on, and it appears that my hit detection is having issues with the ground. Therefore, it's returning a weird position. To fix this, I make a completely new hit detection system, and it results in the game completely breaking. You can't take damage, you can't deal damage, nothing works. So I scramble for a few hours and sort everything out. Now the effects spawn properly and hit detection works perfectly. Now that the game is in a working state, I add a death screen. Then I finally implement the theme of exchange. Defeating a boss will allow you to exchange the boss's clay to level up. Probably the most simple implementation of the theme exchange, but it's the best I got right now. 6 days left and my game still only has a single boss. It's about time to model a new one. I then make a combo chart and start animating. The next day I finish animating and add the boss to the game. The boss is incredibly difficult. She's too fast and deals too much damage. So I start making a bunch of changes. First, I add an indicator to her flurry attacks. Second, I make her staggerable, so you could get in more than just a single hit. Third, I slow down some of her attacks and all of her recovery windows. Lastly, I nerf her second phase attacks to be a bit slower. Finally, the boss is possible to beat. Still a really difficult fight, but quite fun in my opinion. Somewhere in the time of fixing the boss, I also added music. I've been trying to make some music for the game from the very start of the game jam. It took quite a few attempts to get the final result, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. Back to present moment, I added input hints on the side. I did that for the controller inputs as well. They switch depending if you're using a controller or keyboard and mouse. Finally, the game is complete and I upload it to itch and go to sleep. In the morning, I read some feedback and improve dodging. I do this by making the sprint button be different from the dodge button. Previously, you had to hold the dodge button to sprint, but now sprinting is a separate button. This made dodging much more responsive. I also made the dodge's direction change to be almost instant. With a few hours before the jam ends, I updated the game. You can try the game out for yourself, link is in the description. Maybe I should make a full-length Souls-like game. Let me know in the comments. I'm quite happy with the game I made for the jam. I wanted to see if it's doable to make a Souls-like in a short amount of time. And I did just that. Well, the combat part at least. Anyways, we'll see what I'll do next. Bye.